I was texting with a group of clergy colleagues last week about Advent and how to preach it. And we were talking about the doctrine of the second coming. That's the part of the Nicene Creed that says Jesus will come again to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. It shows up in our collect of the day today, and it also shows up in our communion prayer. Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. With that beautiful sense of movement from past to future, from has to is to will. Like many of our teachings, this is at once a uniquely Christian notion and the gentlest of reframings of an idea from the Hebrew Bible, the great day of the Lord, when everyone will live by God's teachings and practice God's justice. Our passage from Isaiah today presents a classic example of that vision. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways and that we may walk in his paths." So in this group chat, one of my colleagues confessed that he needed to work on developing his hope/expectation instinct. "I'm really not waiting for a second coming," he wrote, "at all, except one by one in people's hearts. I feel like I should be better at this by now, LOL." And then I admitted that I'm right there with them. "Truth be told," I wrote, "I'm not waiting for the second coming either. But I still get moved by the yearning in that language from Isaiah on this Sunday, for example, that dream of God's realm of justice and love inhabiting our world. Call it the romantic in me, wishing for the out of reach and impossible." And that's the truth. Friends, if the end of times lands other than is biblically predicted, say sooner by human-made global warming or later by a swelling sun, that is not going to be a deal breaker for my faith. But here's what I will say. This vision of a different world, a more just world, a more holy and loving world, as impossible as it seems, it's so, so beautiful. Just listen to the latter half of that Isaiah reading. "For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning forks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." Even in all my skepticism, I find it hard not to get stirred up by this dream. The deep longing in it, the imagery of this time to come, when the just peace of God breaks into our world so completely that instruments of death lose their usefulness and are instead reshaped into tools of cultivation and nourishment. Swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks. It's a foolish thing to ache for. But maybe foolishness is not the greatest failing as a response to this broken world's intransigent sinfulness. Maybe it's better than cynicism or indifference or despair. I think that's what Paul gets at at the beginning of 1 Corinthians when he affirms that the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks. The idea feels even more foolish at the end of this ghastly fortnight of mass shootings at the gay nightclub in Colorado, at a Walmart, and at a football player's garage in Virginia. I don't want to linger on these massacres except to say this. You know that our repetition of this ritual has reached a new low when the New York Times website reruns an article from 5 years ago comparing our gun violence with other countries. They don't even bother to update anything. Same arguments, same counter arguments, same conversation. Just put it on repeat. But then I think of this Christian activist named Shane Claiborne, who founded a kind of urban monastic community in Philadelphia, literally moving with some friends into a house in a neighborhood where he hoped to participate in fighting poverty and oppression. At one point, over a decade ago, a 19-year-old kid was shot and killed on Claiborne's front porch. But instead of entering the unmoving political script that attends all such events, Claiborne's group asked themselves, what is God's dream for the world? And they decided it was not for one kid to die every day in Philadelphia of gun violence. And they discerned a need to reimagine the world because it doesn't have to stay this way. Inspired by today's passage in Isaiah about turning swords into plowshares, they invited folks to donate their guns. And then they reached out to some blacksmiths who literally beat the guns into new shapes. They turned one AK-47 into a rake and a shovel, and another into 3 hand trowels. They literally turned tools of death into tools of life. You can Google it and see the photos. When I first learned about the effort, I thought it was kind of cool, but also kind of foolish. The tools look a bit awkward to use, honestly. And what is the gesture actually accomplishing in a country that has 20% more firearms than human beings? But now I see Claiborne's effort in a more expansive way, as an act of witness. And I see that every gun transformed into a spade is one less gun that will harm someone. I see that the imagination that gave rise to this work is of God because it remains hopeful in the face of a crisis that feels hopeless, and because it remains creative in the face of an argument that has shut down all creative ideas. And yeah, maybe it is foolish to resist the piling up of gun deaths by turning a handful of rifles into spades and trowels. But if it is the foolishness that Paul speaks of in 1 Corinthians when he proclaims that God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to abolish things that are. And it is that foolishness that dispels cynicism and inertia as it lays before us God's dream of a world free of violence and inequity. A world where swords and spears Glocks and AK-47s will indeed be beaten into farming tools, a world where the nations will study war no more, a world where we accept that ancient invitation to the house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Amen.